In 680, at the Third Council of Constantinople, a monophysite priest by the name of Polychronius had an idea. He thought he could definitely prove that monophysitism was the true faith, not through a debate, not through a theological lecture, not even through a Bible study, but rather by performing a miracle. What was the miracle? He would raise someone from the dead, and this would settle the debate once and for all. And so a dead body was brought into the council. Polychronius laid a monophysite creed on the body and began whispering prayers into the cadaver's ear, hoping he would come back to life. This went on for some time, and when it was clear that this parlor trick was not going to work, Polychronius in the monophysite position was mercilessly mocked by the other bishops. Welcome to the Third Council of Constantinople. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Whycatholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. A huge, heartfelt thank you for joining me today. I am so moved that many of you make this podcast a regular listening routine, and I'm overjoyed by the growing number of supporters of this podcast. I realize that it's unrealistic to give to all of the Catholic influencers and creators out there. So if you are unable to give, or you just think, I'm giving to so many things right now, I can't possibly give to something else, would you consider doing something that is completely free? Would you go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a kind review and a comment? Those ratings and comments help others find this podcast as well. Thank you. And if you'd like to financially support this podcast, there are links in the show notes. This is our 10th episode in the series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils, and today we're going to talk about the 6th Ecumenical Council, the Third Council of Constantinople. And that may be a little confusing. It's the 6th Council, but it's the Third Council. What? Remember that all of the Ecumenical Councils are named after the place where they were held. So this is the third time an Ecumenical Council was held in the city of Constantinople, hence why we call it the Third Council of Constantinople. But it is the 6th Ecumenical Council in church history. Just to reiterate something I talked about way back in episode 146 in our introduction to this series, the church has held thousands and thousands of councils or synods. Any group of bishops can decide to get together and make decisions. However, what makes the ecumenical councils unique is that first, these include a global gathering of bishops. Well, sort of, and by that I'm thinking specifically about the First Council of Constantinople. Secondly, while the Pope may or may not attend them, he ultimately ratifies them. He says, yep, I'm in agreement with this council, and if he doesn't, then they do not become an ecumenical council, like the Robber Council of Ephesus of 449. And something that generally occurs at these ecumenical councils, or at least has so far, is that they put their stamp of approval on previous ecumenical councils. This creates a legacy of ecumenical councils that distinguishes them as a higher authority than the other minor local councils and synods. In the last episode, I focused on the 127 years between the Fifth Council, the Second Council of Constantinople of 553, and the council that we'll talk about today, the Third Council of Constantinople, which began in 680. We talked about what was happening in the Western Roman Empire, particularly in Spain, the war between the Eastern Roman Empire and Persia, and the rise of Islam. If you haven't listened to that episode, you may want to do so before listening to this one. I want to make a note just before we begin diving into this chapter of history. You're going to hear the prefixes dio and mono a lot in this episode. Dio, of course, means two, and mono means one. So, for example, when I mention diophysites, I am referring to those who hold to a two-nature view of Jesus. He is fully human and fully divine. This is the Orthodox viewpoint of Christianity. Also, when I use the term Orthodox, I'm not referring to a specific church like the Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm referring to the mainstream belief of Christianity. Catholics, Orthodox, and mainstream Protestants all adhere to the Chalcedonian diophysite view of Christianity. Jesus had two natures, fully human and fully divine, and we call this the hypostatic union. On the other hand, the monophysites believe that Jesus had only one unified divine nature. In the Byzantine Empire's efforts to bridge this divide between the Catholic Church and these monophysites, they tried things that they thought might appease the monophysites. For example, in 42, Emperor Zeno published the Henoticon, the so-called Act of Unity. Emperor Justinian and the Second Council of Constantinople condemned the 3 chapters in 553. But neither of these worked. They just angered the Western Catholics as well as the monophysites. You'll recall from the last episode that as the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius fought the Persians, he found that the Persians were mainly monophysite Christians. So like his predecessors, he really sought to mend the schism between the diophysites, the Chalcedonian Orthodox Catholic Christians, and the monophysites in order to help foster a unified Roman Empire. So along with Sergius, Patriarch of Constantinople, they invented a new theology called monoenergism. Jesus had two natures, human and divine, but there was one unified divine energy behind both of his natures. Well, this was quickly dismissed by Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, as well as Athanasius I Gemolo, the monophysite Patriarch of Antioch. Seeing that it was clear that monoenergism was neither going to appease the diophysite or monophysite leaders, Emperor Heraclius and Patriarch Sergius pivoted to a slightly different idea, monotheletism. Jesus had two natures, human and divine, but a single divine will. Certain that this would appease both the diophysites and monophysites, Patriarch Sergius sent a letter to Pope Honorius vaguely explaining the idea of monotheletism. And it's in this letter that we find a very clever use of semantics to help sell the idea. Instead of saying God had one will or two wills, it equates two wills as automatically opposing wills. It's like saying, if Jesus had a human will and a divine will, then those wills are by definition at odds with each other. In a letter back, Pope Honorius was like, yes, of course Jesus didn't have opposing wills, but he urged Patriarch Sergius to, quote, avoid the introduced expression of a new vocabulary, one or two activities, and to proclaim with us in Orthodox faith and Catholic unity the one Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, true God, who in two natures affects the works of the Godhead and of the humanity, end quote. In other words, Pope Honorius was like, don't overcomplicate things. Let's just keep the language, terms, and doctrines as they were expressed at the previous councils. By the way, I've included a link in the show notes if you'd like to read the correspondence between Sergius and Honorius. However, Honorius' approach may have proved to be a mistake because Patriarch Sergius took the lack of condemnation from the Pope as a green light to preach monotheletism. Emperor Heraclius then published a document called the Ecthesis in 638, which proclaimed monotheletism as part of the official imperial form of Christianity. After Pope Honorius' death, Severinus was elected as the next pope, and he took a hard stance against the Ecthesis and the monothelite view. This led to a stalemate between Rome and Constantinople, which almost sounds cliche at this point in the series. Emperor Heraclius insisted that he would not confirm Pope Severinus' election unless he signed off on the Ecthesis. A group sympathetic to the emperor and the Ecthesis even plundered the Lateran Palace, the Pope's residence, trying to pressure Pope Severinus into signing the Ecthesis. Severinus didn't give in. Eventually, the papal legate in Constantinople told the dying Heraclius that they would all band together if he didn't approve of Severinus' election. So he finally did. Both Emperor Heraclius and Pope Severinus died shortly after. Let's get to the next group of major players in this debate: Constans the Byzantine Emperor, Pope Martin I, and Maximus the Confessor. Pope Martin intended to hold a council in Rome to debate monothelitism, but before he could, Emperor Constans, who favored monothelitism, tried to halt any further discussion on the matter. So in 648, Constans issued the Typos of Constans, which prohibited any more Christological debates. It was essentially a gag order, particularly aimed at the West. However, Pope Martin I went through with the council, and 150 bishops, along with Maximus the Confessor, condemned monothelitism. For their part in violating the emperor's gag order, Pope Martin and Maximus the Confessor were both arrested and condemned by the emperor. Pope Martin was sent into exile and later died. Maximus the Confessor was tried and then tortured. He had his tongue cut out so that he couldn't speak anymore, and his right hand cut off so he couldn't write. Then he was sent into exile, where he died a short time later. This brings us to our next group of key figures in this debate: Constantine IV, who was the Byzantine emperor, and Pope Agatho. Unlike his predecessors, Constantine IV was not sympathetic to monothelitism, and he sought to put an end to it through convening an ecumenical council. He wrote a letter to Pope Donus requesting a council, but by the time the letter arrived, Donus had died and Pope Agatho had replaced him. Pope Agatho approved of Constantine's idea for a sixth ecumenical council, and he went as far as to do some significant preparations for this council. He convened a number of pre-councils throughout the western part of the empire. The purpose of this was for the western bishops to confirm the diathelite position, explain the diathelite position in the most compelling way, and send these decrees back to Rome. The following Easter, Pope Agatho received the legates from each of the councils along with their decrees. Pope Agatho then wrote a letter which took into account the decisions from all these local councils and identified the most accomplished of the legates to take this letter to Constantinople and represent the Pope and the diathelite position at the Third Council of Constantinople. Just before we talk about the council, we need to understand that this was at the beginning of the Islamic invasions. The Muslims had taken control of 3 of the patriarchates, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. In Jerusalem and Alexandria, the patriarchate sat vacant, and the Patriarch of Antioch was living in Constantinople. The Muslim invasions had even reached the city of Constantinople in 678, but the Byzantine capital was able to resist them. With a lull in the war, the Third Ecumenical Council of Constantinople convened on November 7th, 680, with Emperor Constantine IV presiding and with only 37 bishops in attendance. It could just be that the council started before everyone was able to arrive. There were 18 sessions overall, and the emperor presided over the first 11, and the council concluded 10 months later on September 16, 681. By the time the council concluded, there were at least 174 delegates in attendance, because that's how many signed off on the council's decision. As to what the council decided, upon reading Pope Agatho's long letter, a theological encyclical on the diathelite position, many of the bishops proclaimed that St. Peter had spoken through Pope Agatho. That set the tone for the council. Monotheletism, as well as its cousin monoenergism, were condemned as heresies. In addition to solidifying the diathelite position, the council also affirmed the previous 5 councils. Unlike other councils, though, there were no administrative or disciplinary canons. However, they did include a series of accolades and anathemas. Let me read them. Quote, "Many years to the emperor, many years to Constantine our great emperor, many years to the Orthodox king, many years to our emperor that makes peace. Many years to Constantine a second Marcion. Many years to Constantine a new Theodosius. Many years to Constantine a new Justinian. Many years to the keeper of the Orthodox faith. O Lord, preserve the foundation of the churches. O Lord, preserve the keeper of the faith. Many years to Agatho, Pope of Rome. Many years to George, Patriarch of Constantinople. Many years to Theophanes, Patriarch of Antioch. Many years to the Orthodox Council. Many years to the Orthodox Senate. To Theodore of Pharon, the heretic, anathema. To Sergius the heretic, anathema. To Cyrus the heretic, anathema. To Honorius the heretic, anathema. To Pyrrhus the heretic, anathema. To Paul the heretic, anathema. To Peter the heretic, anathema. To Macarius the heretic, anathema. To Stephen the heretic, anathema. To Polychronius the heretic, anathema. To Apergius of Perga the heretic, anathema. To all heretics, anathema. To all who side with heretics, anathema. May the faith of the Christians increase, and long years to the Orthodox and Ecumenical Council." End quote. So, lots of praise for Emperor Constantine IV. He came out looking like the hero. The 3 patriarchs who were still in existence, Pope Agatho, along with George, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and Theophanes, the Patriarch of Antioch, were also praised. As for the anathemas, you may have caught the names of a few listed. Polychronius was the monophysite priest who attempted to prove that God was on his side by trying to raise a dead body to life. Pope Honorius was also listed in the anathemas. He was the pope we talked about earlier that corresponded with Sergius, and the council anathemized him for not taking a tougher stand in condemning monotheletism like his successors did. The council's decree was sent to Pope Agatho's successor, Pope Leo II, who ratified it, thus officially making it the 6th Ecumenical Council in church history. I want to end by talking about the theology behind this decision. Why did the council decide against monoenergism and monotheletism? On one hand, it seems reasonable to think that Jesus has 2 natures but a single divine energy behind him. But what this undermines is Jesus' humanity. What is a human being? A human being is someone that has its own energy and will. So if Jesus only had one divine will, then is he really human? Or is it more like God dressing up like a human? This is the whole beauty and mystery of the incarnation. It is the fullness of God taking on the fullness of man. God is omniscient, man is ignorant. God is omnipotent, man has limits. God is infinite, man is finite. And we see these 2 wills most clearly in the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. He asks his Father to, quote, "Take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done," end quote. Here we see the conflict of the human and divine wills. But more importantly, we see Jesus' humanity submit to his divinity, and in doing so, he models for us the perfect man, the human that submits to the divine. One last thought. I think Pope Honorius may have gotten thrown under the bus here. He was the one I mentioned earlier who told Patriarch Sergius to not introduce new terms. I personally think that was sound advice. I think oftentimes we want to try and make sense of the complexity of God, so we try and explain the mystery of it all, and I think there's something quite elegant and humble about just leaving things unsaid. Going back to the Council of Chalcedon a couple of hundred years earlier, we see this effort to say just enough without saying too much. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. I know a lot of people that try and re-explain it by saying that Jesus was 100% human and 100% divine. Well, that would be 200%. That doesn't make any sense. No, we're just going to say he's fully human and fully divine and leave it there. There's a mystery here we can't quite explain, and that's okay. It's sort of like the Trinity. So many people want to use analogies to explain the Trinity, and they just stumble into all sorts of heresies in the process. There's something quite beautiful about just saying God is one being in three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Jesus is fully human and fully divine. This is the teaching of Orthodox Christianity, given at the Councils of Chalcedon, Constantinople II, and Constantinople III.
Thank you for joining me for whycatholic. Be sure to subscribe to whycatholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the whycatholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.